Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining today. My name is Shannon Burth, and in this video, I will be using SPSS to demonstrate how to recode variables, test reliability, and compute variables. I'll be using the simulated dataset that accompanies the second edition of the textbook, Quantitative Research Methods in The Power of Numbers for Social Justice. Thanks for joining us. First, a very useful SPSS function is recode. The recode function can be found under the Transform tab. And using the recode function, we can change values from a variable into new values. In SPSS, you can either recode into the same variable or recode into different variables. I personally prefer to recode into a different variable. That way we're never messing with the original data that had come in from either a survey or experiment, and we can recode into a different variable. So I'm going to click recode into different variables. Recoding is useful when you want to collapse data from many categories into fewer categories. For instance, if you measured political ideology from 1, very liberal, to 7, very conservative, as was the case in the simulated sample dataset, perhaps there were very few respondents who identified as 1s or 7s. In order to have fewer categories with more people in each, then you might want to change from 7 values for political ideology to 3 by collapsing those who had responded with a 1 or 2 into those who had responded a 3. And by collapsing those who had responded a 6 or 7 with those that had responded a 5. In doing so, we can combine very liberal, slightly liberal, into together with those who were liberal. And then we can do the same for conservative as well. So in this dialog box, we can locate our survey item that we use to measure political orientation. See it right here. What is your political orientation? Once we have it selected, we can send it over to the middle of the dialog box. And then we're going to change the name for this variable. I'm going to go with POL_recode. So that way it's very clear to me that I recoded this. And then for naming it, we can actually give it a full name. This will be how it shows up in our output box. So, and again, I'm going to make it very clear that it's a recoded variable. I'll select change, and we can see that it's changed over here in our dialog box. Next, going to click old and new values so we can start assigning our values. First thing I'll do is I'm going to recode 1 as 1. That's pretty much the only one that's actually going to stay the same. But our first value can stay as 1. We put our old value, our new value, and then we click add. We're going to move on to our second value, which is 2. And that's going to also turn into 1. Remember, we're condensing the 1, 2s, and 3s all into 1. So 3 will also go into 1. Then we're at 4. 4 is our midpoint. In this instance, it would be considered our moderate participants. So 4 is actually going to become 2. 2 will be our midpoint between 1 and 3 now. And then we have 5, which is where we can move on to our 3. Same for 6. 6 is also going to be a 3. And then 7 will also be a 3. So you'll see here we have our 1s, 2 is our midpoint, and then we have our 3s. Sometimes I do this on paper if it gets a little bit more complex than this, but the system outlines it pretty nicely for you as well. We can also in here, if we have system missing values, SPSS will be able to deal with those if you tell it how to deal with it. But in our sample data set, we don't have any. So I'm just going to click continue. And then I'm going to click OK. So now that we have political recode that came through, you see it added a new variable into our data set. I'm going to go over to variable view, which we can also see it. They always pop up at the very end. And you see how everything else here, the values have labels. Our new variable will not. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in here, and if you double click this, we'll get some little dots. And we can actually start naming what 1 through 3 means. So in this case, 1 means liberal. 2 is moderate. That's our midpoint. And 3 is conservative. In the final check, typically when I do a new variable, I think it's important to run a frequency test. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do analyze descriptive statistics frequencies. It's best to have both our original variable and our new variable so we can compare the two. So I've moved both over here. and I can click OK. We'll have our output. And you'll see here we have all of our 7 categories, very liberal to very conservative, with frequencies that are quite low as they're distributed across 7 groups. But then when we condense them, we have liberal, moderate, and conservative. And the frequencies here are much higher as we collapsed a bunch of the groups. Moderate stays the same as it was our midpoint either time. And then another good check is that the total is still 413 in both instances. So it looks like we recoded that properly. The next thing we're going to do today is perform a reliability analysis, which we can also do in SPSS. And in SPSS, we can test whether multiple items cohere reliably together. This is an important step before actually combining the items into an index. So to do this, we can select Analyze, Scale, and Reliability Analysis. In our power of numbers sample data set, we can select the 7 items that measure the avoidance of a femininity component of the masculine roles and norms index revised. At this point, I want to show a little tip. Typically, you can change change it to show the name of the variable. We can also sort it alphabetically. And when I have things that are named differently, it really helps to see it this way, which it's your preference, but see, I was easily able to find M, R, N, I, A, F, 1 through 7. They're all here together, as opposed to having to see the survey item. This way, we can see our shortcuts. So I'm going to select all 7 of them. We're going to send them over to the item part of this dialog box. And then we're going to click item statistics. We're going to go through and do descriptives for item, scale, and scale if item were deleted. And this is going to give us the mean and standard deviation for each of these. And then we'll go through this more later, but the scale if item deleted will show us what will happen if we had dropped items to develop the scale. I'll click continue for this dialog box. And the last little bit that I want to point out, as mentioned in Chapter 7, a common reliability statistic is Cronbach's alpha, which we'll be using today. And you can see right here, we have the item selected, SPSS defaults to that. So we ran our Cronbach's alpha reliability analysis, and you can see here that our Cronbach's alpha is 0.929. As we also discussed in Chapter 9, the closer this number is to 1.0, the reliability of the items in the analysis cohere around a single concept. So this 9.29, sorry, would round to 0.93, which easily surpasses the 0.65 threshold considered sufficient for reliability, which is good news for how well the items in question measure avoidance of femininity concept, and it means that in subsequent analyses, rather than use 7 separate variables, we can combine all 7 of these into a composite measure or an index, and simply use that single index to represent all 7 items. So in this output box, we see the statistics for each item in here. We have the mean and standard deviation. And then we also have this little bit down here that says item total statistics. And it also has this if item was dropped. So this is if the Cronbach's alpha item was deleted. It shows us the reliability and what that would look like. So all of these values are lower than our original 0.929, which means that if we had dropped any of these items, our reliability would actually decrease. However, in some cases, this gives you a good indication if you can drop any items, and it might bump your Cronbach's alpha up a little bit and make the scale a little more reliable. Finally, I'm going to demonstrate how to form an index. This is the last step in the reliability analysis. It's important to note that the reliability analysis function in SPSS simply tells you whether or not you can or should form an index. It doesn't actually create the index. So if you obtain a sufficiently high Cronbach's alpha on the selected items for measurement, then you can take the next step and use the compute function to actually combine the 7 items into a new variable. With a simulated data set, you can use the compute function to combine the 7 items that we used to measure avoidance of femininity into a single item that is calculated from the mean of the 7 scores. So first, we'll go in and we'll click Transform, Compute Variable, and it'll open up a dialog box that honestly looks quite like a calculator, and we kind of use it the same way you'd use a calculator. Down here, you can search, but you'll see that there's a bunch of different functions that you can choose from. I typically search if I know what I'm looking for. So I'll click mean. These are little placeholders to tell us how these items are going to go in. We're going to separate them with a comma. And like I did in the last instance, it's a little bit easier for me to find my variables when I sort them. So here we go. We have our M, R, N, I, AF, 1 through 7. So we just select them and move them over one by one and put a comma in between. And that's going to give us the mean eventually after we get all of these in here. Next, we go to this target variable spot, and we want to make sure that we have this named properly. As you can see, we're adding up all the M, R, N, I, A, F. That's the shorthand that we're using for this. So I'm going to stick with that. But I'm just going to have AF. So there's no number at the end of it, meaning it's just the index itself. At this point, I can also note that we use the compute function to create an index here, but we can use it in a whole bit of other ways as well. For instance, if you have a variable that you want to measure that measures the number of days per week a respondent reports using social media, and another variable that measures the number of minutes per day that they use social media, we can use this little star function, which is the multiply function in the calculator, to compute the variables together, to compute a new variable of new daily exposure to social media. So now we can proceed, click OK. And if we go to our variable view, we'll see that at the very bottom, we have our new variable, MRNIAF. And again, with the call recode that we made, I want to just double check to make sure this calculated properly. So I can click Analyze, Descriptive Statistics. In this case, I'm going to do descriptives because we did a little bit of math and I want to see the mean and standard deviation here. So this will pop up at the bottom. We can click this, Variables, Options. I'm just going to have mean and standard deviation clicked off. We'll click Continue. Okay. And yep, that looks about right. We still have our 413 as our N, mean and standard deviation calculated for this variable. So that's all today. Thank you for joining us. Be sure to join us in the next video where we're going to learn how to compare means with an independent t-test. Thank you.